right, United States history students. So this is it. This is the end of the Cold War. Hey, think about this. This is an end of a major chapter in American history. What an incredibly long chapter. You guys remember the 1920s and the Red Scare of the 1920s, the Palmer raids, the foundation of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, all that stuff? That was the first Red Scare. And then we had World War II, and then we had the Yalta Conference, and then we had the Truman administration, the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, all of these conflicts that related to the Cold War. And for those of us who grew up in the Cold War, and I would be one of these people, I mean, this defined the United States of America. There were two superpowers in the world. One was the USSR. They had a communist government and economic system. And the other was the United States of America. And we had a democratic system and a more capitalist economic system. The USSR had their friends. The we had our friends. And the world was divided. And when we arrive in the middle of the 1970s, it really seemed like it was going to stay like that forever. In fact, in 1975, there was a huge international meeting called the Helsinki Summit, and there was a document that came out of it called the Helsinki Accords, in which almost every nation in the entire world, but especially the USA and the USSR, agreed that we would respect and honor all other countries' borders and governments. So in other words, there was going to be a communist world, and there was going to be a democratic world, and that was it. And we were going to stay that way, and now we're going to try to play nice. And so there'll be no more, Korean wars and Vietnam wars and all that. So it seemed like in the middle of the 1970s, at the exact same time when the Vietnam War ended, that the Cold War was going to cool down a little bit. It wasn't really going to be a Cold War anymore, but we were just going to adapt this live and let live philosophy. There's going to be a communist part of the world, and there's going to be a democratic part of the world. And there might still be a little tension between us, but hopefully no more fighting. But then the 80s came along, and the 80s were a very exciting decade. There was certainly a change that was felt in international relations, and in terms of what the Americans were doing and what the Soviets were doing. And that really had a lot to do with the leadership of both the United States of America under the Reagan administration and the leadership of the Soviet Union under the Gorbachev administration. These two individuals did a whole lot to end the Cold War. So by the time we get to the end of the 1980s, many people believe, well, the Cold War is all over. And then a couple years after that, on specifically December the 25th, 1991, the USSR collapsed. And there is no longer a USSR. There is instead the Russian Federation and several other countries that broke off of the USSR to form their own country. Countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine. So how did all this happen? How did the Cold War end? This is a fantastic story. It's an exciting story, but I apologize, my students. This might also be a little bit of a long story because, man, I love this stuff. So let's go back to where we left off at the last lecture. Let's go back to the 1970s into the Richard Nixon administration. Boy, Richard Nixon was a very complex and interesting president. Great guy to study. He took office in 1969, vowing to bring peace with honor with the Vietnam War. And you remember from the last lecture that he had Henry Kissinger engage in secret diplomacy in Paris, France, with top North Vietnamese officials, while Nixon began a bombing campaign of North Vietnam. At the same time, we started doing an incursion into Cambodia. And then he also began a Vietnamization process to pull out more troops. And in the end, by 1973, we've got a peace treaty, and the Americans are coming home, especially the POWs. And so it was considered, or rather, it can be said that he fulfilled his pledge to bring peace with honor, to a certain degree at least. Now, 2 years after the peace treaty, the North Vietnamese violated the peace treaty, and the Americans sort of let them take over South Vietnam. So Nixon did that. Now, there are other things that Nixon did. He opened up diplomatic relations with China. China was another communist country. And so the way Nixon thought, he thought, well, okay, if China's a communist country and the Soviet Union's a communist country and we don't like the Soviet Union, how about if we become friends with China? We become more friendly with China. The United States had no diplomatic relationship with China since it had become a communist country in 1949. Nixon opened up diplomacy with China. Originally, he sent over a table tennis team to play ping pong with the Chinese, since the Chinese love ping pong. So we engaged in what Richard Nixon called ping pong diplomacy. And after that rather interesting international cultural phenomenon happened, Nixon goes over to China and he opens up diplomatic relations, and he started Chinese-American trade. This economic relationship that is frequently in the forefront of the news today was actually initiated by Richard Nixon. And what does this do? Well, this makes China have a more positive relationship with the United States of America. And maybe this separates China a little bit from the Soviet Union. And so Nixon feels like he is destabilizing the solidarity of the communist world. It was a very interesting diplomatic move that he made. Most people at the time really admired him for it. Now, the one thing that people remember Nixon for today is a very negative thing, which is the event that's commonly referred to as Watergate. What was Watergate? Well, Watergate is literally an office complex that was and still is in Washington, D.C. And in 1972, one of the offices there served as the headquarters for the Democratic Party's headquarters. So Nixon is the Republican candidate for the presidency in 1972. The Democratic candidate was a man named George McGovern. And in the summer of 1972, there was a burglary at the Democratic Party headquarters in that office in the Watergate complex. And the burglars were caught. They were interesting burglars because they were all wearing suits, and they were clearly trying to steal not money, but information. They were breaking into the files of the Democratic Party. They were trying to plant bugs, little microphones, so they could listen in to what was being said in the office. It was clear that this was political. Now, when the story broke in 1972, it made the papers, but it really wasn't as important of a story as what was going on in Vietnam and other things at the time. So people knew about it. And there was, of course, a trial and an investigation. It was clear that Republicans were behind this. I mean, that should seem obvious. But the initial investigation didn't reveal that the upper level of the Republican Party knew anything about this, that this was sort of a poorly conducted, low-level crime by a few Republicans who wanted to, capture information from the Democrats. And so when you actually got to the election in November of 72, I mean, the Watergate scandal seems like it's over and done with. But then there were two newspaper reporters from the Washington Post. Their names were Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And these two guys started investigating, and they started talking to people, and they had a secret source that they met with in a parking garage who fed them information. And the secret source told Woodward and Bernstein to, quote, follow the money. These burglars who have gone to jail have received a whole lot of money. To be quiet, follow the money. Where does the money lead? And so they began doing this investigation and reporting it in the Washington Post. This more information that was exposed starts to suggest that some upper-level members of the Nixon administration in the White House knew about the break-in before it happened, that they might have been conducting it. So the Senate gets involved and they do their investigation. And by the time you get to late 1973, the Senate is issuing subpoenas to Richard Nixon's closest aides. And one of them, a guy by the name of John Dean, he lets it be known that the president did know about the Watergate break-in and that he was behind it. And it's revealed that Nixon has tape recordings of all of the people that he talks to in the White House, and that these tapes should reveal what Nixon knew before the Watergate break-in happened. And so the tapes are subpoenaed, and as they listen to the tapes, they find that there's large pieces of the tapes that have been deleted. Richard Nixon's personal behavior starts to become strange. He begins firing the attorney generals who are doing the investigation. He seems to be acting a little bit like a guilty man. And then in August of 1974, Richard Nixon becomes the first and so far the only president in American history to resign. It seems very likely that had he not done this, Richard Nixon would have been impeached by the Senate and he would have been removed from office. The Watergate scandal was a very interesting thing in 1973, 1974. The testimonies in Congress were actually being broadcast on television. This was a day and age where we only have 3 television channels, so a lot of people were really absorbed in the investigation. Did the president know? Was the president behind it? It's pretty exciting stuff. But overwhelmingly, when the president of the United States of America resigned in August of 74, it was a fairly sad and disheartening day for Americans, no matter if they liked Nixon or if they didn't like Nixon. There was an overwhelming sense that something was wrong in the United States of America. Vietnam in 1973, even though peace with honor had been achieved, and there was not yet the fall of Saigon, that would happen the following year. But that was a disheartening thing, the entire Vietnam War experience. And then this. It really, for a lot of people at the time, reflected a loss of faith in the government. Now that's one way to look at it, and it's really how a lot of people felt back then. But another way that you can look at this whole Watergate scandal is that government works. Our founding fathers in the Constitution of the United States knew that all people are human beings, including presidents. They're not perfect, and that should a president engage in what the founding fathers called high crimes and misdemeanors, then there is a process by which this president can be removed from office. This is so nobody is above the law. And when it starts to be revealed that, in all likelihood, Richard Nixon knew about the Watergate break-in before it happened, approved of the burglary, then the wheels of government went into motion to investigate him and to put him and to begin the process of impeachment. But it never got to that state, and Richard Nixon resigned. So it was a disheartening moment for many Americans at the time. There was a sense that our country and our government is not in a good place right now, but at the same time, the Constitution's working. All right, so when President Richard Nixon resigns, the Vice President of the United States takes over. Now, Richard Nixon's original Vice President was a man named Spiro Agnew, but Spiro Agnew had previously resigned because he was caught in a financial scandal. He had done illegal things and he had to resign before Nixon. So once again, a lot of people were upset with the government. So Richard Nixon had appointed another vice president. He was confirmed by the Senate. He was from Michigan. Hey, and coincidentally, he played football for the University of Michigan. He had also been on the Warren Commission that had investigated the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and his name was Gerald Ford. Some people like to say that Gerald Ford is the only president never to have been elected. And that's true. Nobody elected him. He was appointed by Nixon and approved by the Senate. And one of the very first things that Gerald Ford does is he pardons Richard Nixon for any crimes he might have committed related to the Watergate event. So even after Richard Nixon resigned, a lot of people thought, well, he's still going to be placed on trial for an illegal activity. And Ford says no. And he proclaims, our long national nightmare is over. Gerald Ford ran for president in 1976 to be elected on his own terms, but he did not get elected. Probably at this point in time, after the Nixon and Ford years and all that had happened, especially with the Watergate scandal, I think a lot of the American people wanted to drift away from the Republicans and elect a Democrat, and a very different type of Democrat. And so Jimmy Carter was elected president in 1976, and he took the oath of office in January of 1977. Jimmy Carter was elected president in 1976 in large part because he was not a Washington insider. He was a very humble man. He was from Georgia. He was a peanut farmer. He did serve in the Navy in World War II, and he was pretty much the opposite of Nixon. Jimmy Carter was not a cocky individual. He was a very humble individual. He was also very straightforward and very honest. There's not a lot of political schmooze and swagger with Jimmy Carter. Probably no political schmooze and swagger with Jimmy Carter whatsoever. It's best to think of him as a farmer from Georgia. And for a lot of Americans in 1976, that seemed to be a bit of a welcome change. Jimmy Carter did something very interesting in his inauguration. When Nixon was inaugurated in January of 1969, protesters, mostly Vietnam War protesters, lined the streets and threw eggs at his car. They held up posters with obscenities on them. And this was due to the division and the anger in the United States due to the Vietnam War. But look at Jimmy Carter here and his wife Rosalind. They actually, during the inaugural parade, got out of their car and walked. This was a symbolic act to show that they were one with the people. They were not behind bulletproof glass in the car. They were out and walking in this parade-like atmosphere. There's no sense that they're better than anybody else. They're sort of like, they're pretty much saying, hey, we're one of you. And hey, isn't this a nice thing with American presidencies, since presidents have limited terms, and when we get tired of one type of president and one political party in charge for a while and then the other political party comes around, there's usually this extreme contrast, especially when one president goes out and the other one comes in. And the Carter administration reflected this in January of 1977. Now, how did Jimmy Carter do as president of the United States of America? For a lot of Americans, not that great. The 1970s are not considered to be a great time. Things weren't good. So here's some of the things that happened that America had to deal with. The United States of America relied a lot on foreign oil, especially oil that came from the Middle East. And one thing our country could do was shop around for whichever country in the Middle East could offer oil at the cheapest price. And in the 1970s, these countries that produced oil, they all got together and essentially formed a union and said, we're going to band together and we're going to agree, all of us, on the price that we will sell our oil to the United States of America or anybody. This organization was called OPEC. OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And so pretty much what this means is the United States of America can't get its gas for as cheap as before. And this helps lead to an energy crisis. So in the 1970s, it was not uncommon for gas stations to run out of gasoline. Now, we're Americans. We're very dependent upon gasoline for our personal cars, for airplanes, for trucks, for boats. We need gas. And so with limited gas, you would have gas stations run out of gas, and then gas would be rationed in particular ways. Depending upon your license plate number, you would only be able to get gas on certain days. That was a method of rationing gas. But obviously this was not good for the economy, and it was really annoying for a lot of Americans. So what was Jimmy Carter's response to this? Jimmy Carter represented conservation. He said we shouldn't use as much. One of the things that happened during the Jimmy Carter administration is the speed limit on interstates was lowered from 70 miles an hour to 55 miles an hour. So in other words, Americans, you're now expected to drive slower. That way you'll conserve more gas. It probably doesn't take too much imagination to understand why a lot of people, when they found out that the president said, hey, I want you to drive slower, were kind of annoyed with the president of the United States. The other thing that Jimmy Carter encouraged Americans to do was to do what he did in the White House. Turn down the thermostat. That'll save energy as well. Turn down the thermostat and wear a sweater. So turn down that thermostat from 72 degrees Fahrenheit to maybe 66 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a little chilly, but hey, put on a sweater. Conserve energy. Some people are okay with this. Yeah, conserving energy, that's good for the environment. But other people felt like, no, I should be able to drive as fast as I want, or if I want to heat my home, I should be able to heat my home. And this was the 1970s. Probably the worst thing that happened during the Carter administration was an event called the Iran hostage crisis. The country of Iran is in the Middle East. It borders Iraq. It had been on very friendly terms with the United States of America following World War II, and then in the 1950s. In the 1950s, the United States of America supported a king of Iran. And this king of Iran was very friendly to the West, but he was also a king. So Iran wasn't necessarily democratic. And in 1979, there was a revolution. Now here's what you need to know about the revolutionaries who overthrew the government of Iran in their capital city of Tehran, Iran. They were fundamentalist, conservative Muslims. They did not like the United States of America that they perceived as propping up this king in the 1950s. The king, who was referred to as the Shah, was actually not in Iran at the time of the revolution. He was in the United States, of all places, receiving medical treatment. And these fundamentalist conservative Muslims who overthrew the government, they didn't like the United States of America, and they referred to the United States of America as the Great Satan. They believed that American culture was evil. So in the process of the revolution, young men, students who were in the capital city of Tehran, besieged the American embassy. They broke into the embassy, and the embassy is technically American soil. So this was, I guess you can sort of call it an invasion of the United States. They break into this building, they break into the American embassy, and they capture the Americans who were working at the embassy. And they hold them hostage. And this was the Iran hostage crisis. Now you're Jimmy Carter, what are you going to do? How do you rescue these hostages? I mean, a hostage situation is a very delicate situation because if you just try to go and rescue them, well, the hostages can always get killed by the people who are holding them hostage. But Jimmy Carter did launch a rescue operation for the hostages, and this turned out to be a debacle. This is a terrible image of what happened. Our military went into Iran flying these Apache helicopters. They got caught up in a dust storm and they crashed. The image that you see at the bottom of the screen is the charred remains of an American pilot who was part of this rescue operation. The operation was a complete failure, and the United States of America, and specifically President Carter, comes out looking very foolish. Jimmy Carter will spend the remainder of his administration attempting to negotiate the release of the hostages. Will those hostages ever come home? Yes, they will. The Iranian government, the new revolutionary Iranian government, arranges to have those hostages sent back to the United States of America the day that Jimmy Carter steps down from office. Another major international event that happened during the Carter administration was the Soviet Union invaded a country to the south of it called Afghanistan. Why did the Soviet Union invade Afghanistan in the year 1979? Well, in the capital city of Kabul, Afghanistan, there were communists that took power in 1979, and then they were forcibly removed from power. The Soviet Union used this event in Kabul, Afghanistan, as an excuse to go into Afghanistan to support the communists there who were trying to take control of the country. And so the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, this mountainous country that is part of the Himalayan mountain range, because the Afghan people and the Afghan government are their civilization is very undeveloped. They don't have major industries. There's not a lot of manufacturing that takes place in Afghanistan. Their military isn't really seen to be a very strong military. The Soviet Union, when they invaded in '79, they thought that this was going to be a very swift and easy takeover of an undeveloped country. And the Soviet Union was very wrong. One way to understand the Soviet-Afghan War, which lasts from 1979 to 1988, is that it's sort of like our Vietnam War. I mean, Vietnam is very rural, it's very undeveloped. They didn't really have a strong military, that at least not a traditionally strong military. So people thought, probably back in the early 60s, Vietnam, who are they? We'll be able to destroy them in a week. And we were cocky and we were wrong. And that's what the Soviets did in Afghanistan. They thought this was going to be easy, and it was not. Which is why a lot of people call the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan the Soviet Union's Vietnam War. All right, but we don't really know that back in 1979. But we look at the Soviet Union as doing this incredibly aggressive move, trying to take over another country. So the United States, how do we respond? President Carter, how do we respond? Do we send troops over to Afghanistan? Do we send guns over to Afghanistan? What do we do? Jimmy Carter does none of that. His most significant response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was to boycott the 1980 Olympics, which were to be held in Moscow that year. So in other words, our way of showing our disapproval to the Soviet Union was to hold our athletes back and say, we're not going to participate in the Olympics. Do the Olympics still happen? Yes, they do. It's just the United States is not there as a form of protest. Now imagine what the American response of this is going to be. We don't participate in the '80 Summer Olympics. We did participate in the Winter Olympics, which happened here in the United States, in New York. But for many Americans, there was a great deal of frustration about this. There was a feeling like, oh, come on. The Soviets have done this bad, evil thing. At least let us kick their butt in basketball. And did this protest have any effect on the Soviet Union? No, not really. What it meant is the Soviets actually took the majority of the gold medals in the 1980 Summer Olympics. This was probably a very poor political move on the part of Jimmy Carter. 2.5 years into his administration, Jimmy Carter gave one of the most interesting presidential addresses in all of American history. In this address of July 15, 1979, he meant to address the energy crisis and his conservation policies. And in this address, he gets spiritual. He tries to be absolutely honest with the American people. He states openly, and some people just felt like this was a brutally honest speech. He states openly, the American people have lost their confidence in the American government. And we're forgetting what it means to be an American. We're forgetting the spirit of our founding fathers. We're losing our collective identity, and we're only concerned about our own individual selfish pursuits. We're losing our American spirit. And as he addressed the American nation live on television, he pounds his desks a couple of times while he's saying this. It was a spiritual speech. It was also a moralizing speech. Now, some people, when they hear this speech, they feel what the president wanted them to feel, which is, yes, we need to do more to make America wonderful. We need to remember the vision of our founding fathers. We need to become a family again, work hard to take care of each other. But many other people didn't like the moralizing, what they sort of felt was a condescending tone of the President of the United States of America. And this speech, coupled with his reaction, President Carter's reaction to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, coupled with the unresolved hostage crisis, all these things paved the way for his loss in the 1980 election to the Republican contender, the former governor of California, a man by the name of Ronald Reagan. And just like Jimmy Carter was a very different president from Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan will be a very different president from Jimmy Carter. And Ronald Reagan will play a very important role in the ending of the Cold War era. Ronald Wilson Reagan will serve 2 terms as President of the United States of America from 1981 until 1989. His presidency will define the 1980s. One cannot talk about the 1980s without discussing the impact of the Ronald Reagan administrations. And throughout the entire scope of all American history, Ronald Reagan is typically considered to be one of the greatest conservative Republican presidents. He passed away in 2004, and today he's considered to be a bit of an icon. So let's learn at least a little bit about Ronald Reagan, who he was, where he came from, before we get into what type of president he was. Ronald Reagan was born into a family of actors. Both his mom and his dad were in the entertainment business. Ronald Reagan's childhood was defined by moving around from town to town to town within the United States of America. A sad but very formative aspect of Ronald Reagan's youth was the fact that his dad was an alcoholic, and this was very embarrassing for a young Ronald Reagan. When Ronald Reagan was only in elementary school, his dad came home one night drunk and passed out in the front yard, and little Ronald Reagan had to go and drag his dad in to the house from the front yard, and this was a very embarrassing thing. No child should ever have to pull their drunk dad in from the front yard while the neighbors are watching. So this had an impact on Ronald Reagan. When he grew up, he avoided alcohol. As an adult man, when he would go to parties and he would be offered a drink, he accepted it. He didn't want to be rude and he didn't want to stand out as different, but he would only barely sip it. Ronald Reagan spent a lifetime avoiding intoxication. As a boy and a young man, and all the way through his adulthood, Ronald Reagan spent a lot of time not talking about himself and his personal experiences, but rather when he engaged in conversation with people, he liked making jokes. This made him a young man who was always fun to be around. He'd tell jokes, he'd make you laugh, and on top of that, he was an athlete. He played football, and he all around enjoyed sports. He was sort of, seemingly, the all-American boy. Now take a moment to look at this photograph right here. This is a photograph of a very young Ronald Reagan in his late teens, and as you can see, he was a lifeguard. This was a summer job for Ronald Reagan. Now, of all the presidents that we've talked about in United States history, I don't think I've ever talked about the summer job that any of these presidents had when they were a boy, but I will with Reagan, and here's why. After Ronald Reagan was president, in the year 1994, Ronald Reagan publicly announced that he had Alzheimer's and that he would begin to remove himself entirely from public life. Now, I assume that most of you know what Alzheimer's is. It's a brain disease. It literally eats away the brain. And the consequence of this brain disease is you lose your memory. Ronald Reagan would pass away in the year 2004. So for the last 10 years of his life, he was completely removed from the public, where he sadly, gradually lost his memory. He forgot almost everything about his life. He forgot that he was president of the United States for 2 terms. He forgot that he helped to end the Cold War. He forgot about his acting career prior to being a president. He forgot that he was governor of California during the 1960s. He even, and this is very sad, sometimes didn't recognize his own wife or members of his own family when they came to visit him. But what's amazing is, the one thing Ronald Reagan never forgot was that he was a lifeguard as a teenage boy. So his family, when they came to visit him, they would ask him to recall the stories of being a lifeguard. They brought this very portrait to his room and set it up so that he could look at it. It's interesting to think about how our brain works, and if one of us should suffer from Alzheimer's, of all the things that we're going to forget, what is it that our brain is going to remember, and is there any significance to that? So whenever I think about the character of Ronald Reagan, one of the things that I always try to remember is his identity was intertwined with being a lifeguard. Now, when Ronald Reagan entered his 20s, he followed the career path of his parents and he became an actor. and he became relatively famous. By the 1940s and 1950s, most Americans have heard of Ronald Reagan. Of all of the films that he made, there were a couple of films that he was particularly proud of. One is a bit of a psychological film in which Ronald Reagan becomes seriously injured and how he copes with being seriously injured. And that film is called King's Row. And the other one is a great football film, which is probably his most popular film that's remembered today. And that film is called Knute Rockne, All-American, in which Ronald Reagan stars as the football hero that he probably always wanted to be. Now, when the 1960s come around, and most Americans have televisions, Ronald Reagan got a job hosting a daytime television series in which they showed old movies, and Ronald Reagan hosted the movies. And so he would talk about the movies, sort of before and after commercial breaks. And one of the things that Ronald Reagan started doing, and one of the reasons why Ronald Reagan got fired from this job, is that he started offering political commentary during the film. Or, I'm sorry, not during the film, but as he's talking about the film. Now, interesting, Ronald Reagan was not always a conservative Republican. From his childhood through the early 1960s, Ronald Reagan, like many people of his generation, was greatly inspired by the great Democratic president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. And Reagan was a big supporter of Roosevelt and the New Deal and the Democratic Party. But when the 1960s roll around, the early 1960s, Ronald Reagan felt himself drifting more and more and more towards conservative politics. And it was this conservative political commentary that he was issuing during these jobs where he was supposed to be talking exclusively about the film that first get him fired, but also it gets the attention of the Republican Party, because now here is a famous American who is handsome, he's funny, and he's politically conservative. So needless to say, Ronald Reagan would probably make a popular Republican candidate. In the 1960s, he was very supportive of Barry Goldwater, if you remember who Barry Goldwater was from the Vietnam War lectures. And then Reagan gets into politics himself. And because Reagan is a Hollywood film star, he's living in California, although he himself owns a ranch up in Central California around Sacramento. Reagan becomes the governor of California for a period of time during the 1960s. And Reagan begins developing and advocating for a particular conservative view on American politics and on the role he believes the United States should play in relationship to other countries, especially in the Cold War, how the United States of America should interact with the Soviet Union and other communist countries. So if there's any phrase that we can best associate with what Ronald Reagan thinks about the government and the role of government and what it should be in our lives, it's this. Ronald Reagan would say, the problem with government is government. So what's this mean? All right. From Ronald Reagan's perspective, even though he was very influenced by Franklin D. Roosevelt during the 1930s, during the Great Depression era, Ronald Reagan, by the time we get to the 60s, does not like the trend that began with Franklin D. Roosevelt. And I'm talking about the New Deal plans. The idea that the United States government should be the caretaker for the people. So, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who's one of the greatest Democratic presidents in American history, he wanted to save America during the Great Depression, and how does he do this? He begins taxing the wealthiest people, millionaires in particular. If you are a millionaire during the FDR years of the Great Depression, 75% of your income is going to be taxed. The government then collects this money and creates opportunity and security for everybody in the United States of America. So these would be the New Deal plans, things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Civilian Conservation Corps. You remember all that alphabet soup from the 1930s. So we begin to have increased taxation and the government providing more jobs and opportunity for everybody in the United States. We have Social Security that comes around, Medicare and Medicaid, And this continues on through the 1960s, where you have Lyndon B. Johnson and his reforms, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Great Society geared towards ending poverty in the United States of America. This had been the movement of the United States, or especially the Democratic presidents, from FDR all the way through Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s. And by the time we get to 1980, when Ronald Reagan successfully runs for president, the American economy was in a state of what they called back then stagflation. Stagflation is a combination of two words, stagnation and inflation. What had become stagnant were wages. People weren't getting a pay increase. They weren't making more money. But at the same time that your paycheck is remaining the same, we're having inflation. So goods are costing more and more and more money. And the Carter administration had not really been able to deal with this economic recession of the late 1970s and into the early 1980s. It lasted. And if you remember, Jimmy Carter's general attitude was be more conservative. And I don't mean conservative there in the political sense. I mean it in terms of your use of energy, your use of gasoline, and maybe be willing to cut back on your personal spending. Jimmy Carter was definitely not a materialist. He was personally a very spiritual man. He was a very Christian man. And in his Crisis of Confidence speech, he tried to tell Americans to let go of your desire to be a greedy, individualistic person. We're all in this together. We should all pull together as a team. We should all work hard together. And he invoked some of the imagery of the founding fathers and the struggles they went through to form our country. And we shouldn't forget that. And we should remember we're all a country. We should think collectively, not individualistically. And those were powerful words for some people. They were condescending, moralistic words for other people. But the fact remained that the economy wasn't that great. If you wanted to buy a house or a car in the late 1970s, there were incredible interest rates that you'd have to pay in order to, once you got your loan, and you had to pay the bank back. And not everybody had the money to do that. So along comes Reagan. And what's Reagan say? Reagan says the problem with government is government. And what we need to now do is reverse the tide of creating a bigger and bigger government with more government institutions and more government regulations. We need to begin cutting all that back. So one of the very first things that Reagan does when he becomes president in January of 1981 is he begins instituting economic reforms. As Reagan himself said, we're going to turn the bull loose, as in the Wall Street bull. All right. There are several terms that are used to describe Reagan's economic policy. Some people just simply call it Reaganomics. Probably a more easy to comprehend metaphor for his economic policy is called trickle-down economics. A more technical term for this is supply-side economics. So here is the theory of Reagan's economic policy. The first thing Reagan says we're going to do is cut taxes, and cut taxes significantly. Now, with fewer taxes, the government is going to have far less cash to be able to fund federal organizations. Organizations for, like, the National Endowment for the Arts. Less money for scientific research. Less money for national parks. This means that organizations like these and other organizations, dozens of other organizations, they're going to have to start cutting programs. They're going to have to start letting people go. In other words, firing employees because they can't afford to pay them. It also means that there are going to be organizations like the SEC, the Security and Exchanges Commission, or the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. They're going to have less funding, which means they're not going to be able to do their jobs as effectively. They're not going to be able to regulate the banks if it's the SEC, or they're not going to be able to monitor or regulate trading on the stock market as well. The FDA might not be able to monitor food as well, or to regulate, the food that's being sold in grocery stores. And you might think to yourself, that sounds awful. Less money for the arts, for sciences, for parks, there's deregulation, and those are all important things in the United States of America. So why would we cut that? Okay, but here's the flip side of all this, and here's where the metaphor of trickle-down economics should help you understand what Ronald Reagan is thinking. First of all, when we cut taxes, that provides you as an individual American with more money. And that's a good thing, because if you have more money, then you can live a more secure life, and this makes you probably feel better. I don't think too many people out there who don't enjoy having more money. But then you can also spend that money. So here we go. This is what trickle-down economics means. If I have more money, then I can do more stuff with that money. I could use that money to go out and maybe buy a car, and that'll help to stimulate the automobile industry. I would be able to maybe invest more in other companies, and that would stimulate, well, what other companies I'm investing in. And then with deregulation, that provides more opportunities for those companies to do things to make more money. And so what you're hearing here is hopefully more money, more money, more money, more money. The American economy is going to rebound. And so that's what trickle-down economics is. And so if you take a look at the image I have here on this slide, hopefully that makes sense. More people who have more money will then therefore go out and spend that money. More people buying things means more opportunity for sales for businesses. Individuals have more stuff. Businesses are making more money. And then from the business side of things, with deregulation, there's more opportunity for growth. It also might mean as a business, you might be able to do some shady things to make your money, but you're still going to make money and the economy is going to grow. So a great way to understand trickle-down economics is to think about the wealthiest of Americans. Now, FDR's attitude was, if you're a millionaire, we're going to tax 75% of your income. With Ronald Reagan, he's like, no, we're going to do the exact opposite. We're going to allow you to be as filthy, stinking rich as you can be. Because if you are super rich, then you're going to go and you're going to buy, mansions and Ferraris and, a yacht or whatever. You're going to hire people to clean your house for you. You're going to do all these things, and doing those things actually is a boon for the economy. It helps to generate economic growth. You're also going to probably invest your money into companies to help them grow. And so a small company gets an investment from a millionaire. Well, that's great for that small company. And so it benefits all. And so hopefully I'm over explaining this and you understand the concept of trickle-down economics. All right, so this was Reagan's plan, and he begins instituting it almost immediately in 1981. Cut taxes, cut government programs, reduce government spending, let the people have more money. For Ronald Reagan, what was going to save the United States of America was the entrepreneurial, capitalistic spirit that he believed our country was founded on. All right, now the big question is, did this work? Did the United States of America have an economic rebound during the Reagan administration? All right, so in order to answer this question, it sort of depends on how you look at it. Let's look at it first as, did this work for the United States of America in the 1980s? And then did it last? Okay, so first, did it work? Yes, it worked. Was there economic growth in the 1980s? Yes, there was economic growth in the 1980s. With Reagan's policies, it sure was a lot easier to be able to afford a home or a car by the time you get to the late 1980s than it was 10 years before in the late 1970s. There was economic growth. Now, did it last? So the deregulation, specifically of banks, ended up causing some trouble when you get to the end of the 1980s, going into the early 1990s. In 1989, there was something called the savings and loan crisis. Essentially, what was happening in the late 1980s, because of deregulation, there were particular bankers who were taking people's money, people who had put their money into savings accounts, into banks. And these bankers were using this money for themselves to invest in so that they could make money for themselves and then, put that money and then, hopefully give the money back to the people. But anyway, you had bankers who were using people's money in a way that they weren't allowed to. And they tended to be investing in what they called high yield investments, these essentially big gamble investments that would have a big payoff in the end. And this is not legal. They were not allowed to be doing this. But because of deregulation, there wasn't much oversight and they could get away with it for a while until they didn't make their money back and the banks began to foreclose. And the people who put their money into these banks, they lost their money. And this sparked a recession in the early 1990s. And because there was this recession in the early 1990s, some historians believe that this is why in the year 1992, which was an election year, the Democratic candidate, whose name was Bill Clinton, was able to become president because the Democrats were able to criticize the Republicans on these lax deregulatory rules, or this lax deregulation rather, excuse me. All right, so did trickle-down economics work? Well, it's up for you to decide. There's my brief and probably very incomplete summary of it. Now, the one thing trickle-down economics did, and Reagan's attitude towards the government, and this whole economic theory that you should be allowed to get as rich as possible and by pursuing wealth that actually benefits everybody, this had an enormous cultural impact on the 1980s. For some people, this defines the 1980s, and this certainly is reflected in the arts and entertainment of the 1980s, such as television shows, especially in the early and mid 1980s, television shows that celebrated the lives of the wealthiest Americans, all fictitious people, but these super rich people. Television shows like Dallas, television shows like Falcon Crest, television shows like the one that you see this image of here, Dynasty. And all of these shows were extraordinarily popular shows that a lot of adults watched. And for younger people in the 1980s, people like me, your teacher, there were pop stars that we saw celebrating this new pursuit of materialism and wealth. And probably the best example of a pop musician who celebrated being wealthy and materialistic would be the pop singer that you see here, Madonna. Madonna released her second album in 1984. It was a highly socially controversial album called Like a Virgin, and the song Like a Virgin was highly controversial for sexual reasons. But another single on the song that was extraordinarily popular was this one. It was called Material Girl, slightly less controversial than Like a Virgin, but certainly noteworthy and interesting in how Madonna unabashedly celebrates material pursuits. It's okay to be wealthy. Here's some lyrics. Let's take a listen.
You want it?
But perhaps the most famous example throughout the 1980s of this Reaganomics attitude comes from not a song, but a film. This film came out in the late 1980s. It was called Wall Street, and it starred Michael Douglas as this big-time executive who could be ruthless in his pursuit of wealth. He could be ruthless in terms of how he destroyed other companies. And there's this very famous moment in this film in which he explains here's why he's doing this. Here's his justification of his pursuit of wealth. And he explains how, and here's the quote, "Greed is good." So we're going to listen to this excerpt, and I want you to pay attention to, the whole thing. It's very short, but also at the end of it. At the end of his little speech here, you get the Ronald Reagan idea of that the problem with government is government, because he criticizes the United States government for being a failing corporation. All right, here we go. Let's take a listen.
I am not a destroyer of companies. I am a liberator of them.
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms. Greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind, and greed, you mark my words, will not only save Teldar Paper, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the USA. Thank you very much.
All right. Now, there was a new word in the 1980s used to describe people who subscribe to this lifestyle and this culture of the pursuit of material goods and the pursuit of wealth. They were called, in full, young urban professionals, but nobody called them that back in the 80s. They were simply called yuppies. And the yuppies were people like you see stereotyped here. They liked fine clothes, they liked new devices, they liked extravagant lifestyles. Their car of choice was always a BMW. And these were the yuppies of the 1980s. And you think, well, boy, has American culture changed. In the 1960s, we had the hippies, and the hippies were the opposite of all this. They didn't want to pursue material goods and wealth and extravagant living. No, what did the hippies value? The hippies valued free love, expanding your consciousness, drugs, rock and roll. Some of them wanted to live with next to nothing in a commune in Northern California, or they wanted to huddle together with like 12 other people in a townhome in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco. Those were the hippies. And you're like, wow, the hippies and the yuppies, these are the exact opposite. And in some cases, some of these former hippies from the 60s now become the yuppies of the 1980s. And in some cases, there are the old hippies from the 60s who just are absolutely disgusted with the yuppies of the 1980s. And this kind of clash between the hippie mentality and the yuppie mentality also came out in a television sitcom in the 1980s that was very popular. It was also, when I was growing up, one of my personal favorite shows. It was called Family Ties. Now, Family Ties is sort of your all-American family sitcom television show. But part of the family drama of Family Ties was you had a mom and a dad that you see here. And mom and dad are old 60s hippies. They have a hippie attitude. They are anti-materialistic. They believe in love. They love rock music. The dad works for, and I forget what mom does, but dad works for the public television station. So he works for PBS, right? And then there are the kids. And of all of the kids, the one that draws the most attention is the boy. Now, this is the Keaton family, and the boy's name is Alex P. Keaton, who is played by the young actor Michael J. Fox. Now, I'm assuming not a lot of you have seen the television show Family Ties, but you may have heard of Michael J. Fox. He became even more famous when he starred in a film series called Back to the Future. Now, in Family Ties, he plays a very different type of character than he did in Back to the Future, where he was a skateboarding time traveler. In Family Ties, he represents a young Republican of the Reagan era. And so hopefully you can see how this is going to lead to some comedy, how the hilarity will ensue, because you've got mom and dad who are trying to raise their son to be anti-materialistic and not to pursue wealth. And their son, who's a young Reagan Republican. He had a huge poster of Richard Nixon in his bedroom. His favorite board game is Monopoly. He will frequently, like you see here in this image, wear a shirt and tie and sometimes a suit to school. He doesn't carry a backpack. He doesn't wear a backpack, but he rather carries a briefcase. That was the character of Alex P. Keaton, portrayed by Michael J. Fox. Now, the other reason why I always like to talk about Family Ties is because, well, let me show you this image. Of all the sitcoms in American history, this is the only one that I know of that was situated in Columbus, Ohio. So this is, I think, reason enough to go back and occasionally watch old episodes of Family Ties because, hey, it takes place in our hometown of Columbus. All right, so let's watch a film clip of Family Ties and Alex P. Keaton kind of revealing his Reagan Republican attitude here. Let's have some fun with this.
Okay, now, we're gonna need a business manager to help us avoid paying taxes.
Taxes?
A tax is a terrible, hairy, liberal monster with big teeth. And the only thing that can stop the terrible tax monster is a Republican. Who wants to be a Republican?
All right. Now, Ronald Reagan is going to be one of the major players in ending the Cold War. So let's talk about his attitude towards the Soviet Union and towards communism as a whole. When Ronald Reagan first becomes president in 1981, he certainly did not seem like he was going to end the Cold War, but rather really heated up. He doesn't want to be friendly or diplomatic with the Soviet Union. He wants to be really tough on them. He really perceives them as evil. And he actually uses this word evil when he's giving a speech to evangelical Christians in Florida in 1983. And it's in this speech, he cautions his listeners. Don't think of, and I'm paraphrasing Reagan here, he says, don't think of the Cold War as some big misunderstanding where both sides are equally at fault. Democracy is right and communism is bad. This is a struggle of good against evil, and we are on the right side. And in this speech, and here's where I actually have quotes because this is exactly what he says, he refers to the Soviet Union as an evil empire. Of course, the Soviet Union is going to know about all of these speeches, and they're gearing up. They're starting to feel like, the United States of America might be ready to go to war with us. And the Soviet Union has even more reason to fear when Ronald Reagan, as much as Reagan loves cutting the federal budget for almost every branch, not every branch of government, but rather every department in the government, the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Park Service, all that. The one thing he actually increases federal spending for, and quite significantly, mind you, is the United States military and our defense. Essentially, the United States of America begins flexing its muscles, its military might during the Reagan administration. We don't cut back the amount of nuclear weapons that we are producing. We increase the number of nuclear weapons that we produce. Ronald Reagan, our lifeguard president, believes strongly in that the United States military, the job of the United States military is to protect the American people, and we should build up and strengthen and celebrate the United States military. We have the ability to come up with the most technologically advanced submarines, battleships, and fighter planes in the world, including this one, which was developed in the early 1980s. This is the B-1B. This is an airplane that flies faster than any other airplane. It flies twice the speed of sound, and it's a bomber. So it can fly super fast to a target destination, bomb, turn around and get away faster than any other plane can chase it down. It costs nearly $300 million per plane to produce. And for the Americans, this makes us feel good. We've got this great weapon of war to defend our country. But for the Soviets, the Americans seem to be, in both word and in action, acting very aggressively, like they're getting ready for a major military conflict. And this puts the Soviets on edge. But this reflects Ronald Reagan's way of thinking. America is right. Democracy and capitalism is right. For him, it's very black and white. There's no gray area here. Communism is evil. And we are going to develop our capitalist economy. We're going to develop our military. And we're going to be ready, if it happens, for a fight. Now, let me be clear. Reagan does not want the fight. He simply wants to be able to defend the United States of America. He also knows this about the Soviet Union. The economy of the Soviet Union in the early 1980s is struggling. He knows that the United States economy is stronger than the Soviet economy. So here's what he's thinking. Okay, if I build 100 more nuclear missiles, then the Soviet Union is going to feel like, the United States has more nuclear missiles. We have to build more nuclear missiles. So they'll start spending money on nuclear missiles. Now, when they start spending money on nuclear missiles, that's less money they have to feed their people and to provide goods and services for their people, which might cause a revolt within this USSR. So by building up the American military, the Soviet Union will feel a need to respond. Maybe they want to build a B-1, B-2 or something like it. And when the Soviet Union starts doing that, they won't have the money to take care of their people. People revolt and maybe even overthrow the communist system of the Soviet Union. So by developing our military and by pouring billions of dollars into our military, it was, for Ronald Reagan and the Reagan administration, somewhat of a form of economic warfare. Okay, I hope that made sense. But Ronald Reagan is an extraordinarily complex person. He's a very interesting president to study. Ronald Reagan, when he built up the American arsenal, there were protests all over the world, especially in Europe, because the Europeans felt if there's ever going to be World War III, it's going to happen here, where World War I and World War II happened. It's probably most likely going to happen in Berlin. And so there were all these protests in the street, protests against Ronald Reagan and the nuclear buildup in the United States of America, because they saw that as potentially leading to a nuclear exchange and the end of civilization. And there were also, although to a lesser degree, protests here in the United States of America. Some of these protests were led by Ronald Reagan's own daughter, who was herself very against the nuclear buildup that was happening in the United States of America. That seemed to be destabilizing the otherwise, live and let live attitude that was existing between the United States of America and the Soviet Union since the middle of the 1970s. But Ronald Reagan very much believed in what he was doing. Until, and get this, until he saw a movie. This movie came out in 1983. It was not a film that premiered in the theaters. This was actually a made-for-TV movie. The name of this movie was called The Day After. And The Day After is about what life would be like in the United States of America, and specifically the town of Lawrence, Kansas, in the United States of America, the day after a nuclear exchange. Now, throughout the entirety of the Cold War era, but especially in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, there were plenty of science fiction films about what life would be like on Earth after a nuclear war. There were a lot of movies like this. But the difference with The Day After is that The Day After was written with the aid of scientists. Most of the other movies were made just out of, people's imagination. Like, well, what do you think life would be like after a nuclear exchange? Who would live? Who would die? Inevitably, in all those post-nuclear apocalyptic films, there were cockroaches everywhere, since it was, this myth that cockroaches can survive everything, and so the world will be run by cockroaches, or a bunch of silly stuff like that in those films. Anyway, The Day After was scripted with the help of scientists who said, here's exactly what's going to happen. They chose a city in the United States of America that was not a primary target of the Soviet Union. So they chose the city of Lawrence, Kansas, which is where the University of Kansas is located, and what life would be like there. So in Kansas, you would see the mushroom clouds from the nuclear attacks happening all around you, but you weren't hit directly. But what would happen would be the fallout. So the radioactive nuclear dust would go up into the sky. This fallout would snow down on you. You would breathe this stuff in, and it would destroy your central nervous system. It would destroy you from the inside out, and people would be dying all around. Brains essentially turn to mush, and people become what it seems to be like zombified, and they're walking around killing each other and dying these excruciatingly painful deaths. It was a horrible, very, very upsetting film. And of course, there were parental warnings that came out about this film, that this film is going to be very difficult to watch. And then after the film was over, there was actually a panel of scientists who discussed the film. Okay, so, millions of Americans watched this made-for-TV movie and were upset by it. And the president watched this made-for-TV movie. According to Reagan's biographer, Edmund Morris, who was spending time with the president and had full access to the president's diaries, Edmund Morris wrote in his biography of Reagan, which is called Dutch, about how depressed this movie made Ronald Reagan, and how Reagan felt that he had to dedicate his life to making sure that this scenario never plays out in the United States. Now, here's something about Reagan that I didn't mention. He took the oath of office in January of 1981. In March of 1981, he was shot. He was shot by a man who was criminally insane, and Ronald Reagan came very close to being killed. That bullet ricocheted off of his rib. It missed his heart within millimeters. Reagan was rushed into surgery. The surgeon struggled greatly to remove the bullet without causing further injury. And this experience profoundly impacted Ronald Reagan. First of all, throughout the remainder of his 2 terms as president, Reagan never fully recovers his strength, his physical strength. But he also felt like God had saved him. Reagan was himself a very religious man, very Christian man, and he felt that, God was actively involved in having him become president, and that God had spared him this assassin's bullet, and that he now owed the rest of his presidential administration to God. And that experience, coupled with watching this movie, inspired Reagan to do something big. He said, I want to do something to completely end the possibility of nuclear war on Earth. All right. Hey, before I talk to you about what that is, it's worth noting that Ronald Reagan always had his sense of humor. When Ronald Reagan was getting ready to receive the anesthesia, to get knocked out before the surgery, he looked at the surgeon and he joked with him. He said, "Why, I hope you're a Republican." And then after he was done with the surgery and his wife Nancy met with him, he saw her and she's in tears, and he said, "Sorry, honey, I forgot to duck." So testimony, this is so very Ronald Reagan-like. He never complained about anything. He never talked about his personal feelings about anything. He always deflected anything with humor and storytelling. Okay, so all right, so back to the impact that this has on Ronald Reagan's life, both the assassination attempt and then watching the day after, and his big idea for how he wants to end the possibility of nuclear war. All right, so this was a big dream that Ronald Reagan had. He called it the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. Here was Ronald Reagan's vision. He wanted to initiate a program in the United States military where we would launch into outer space satellites, artificial man-made satellites that would hover over the United States. Now, at this point in time in history, both the United States of America and the Soviet Union have something called ICBMs, and ICBM stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles, and that should describe what they are. They're missiles that could be fired from one continent and go to another continent to attack them. So in other words, the Soviets could launch missiles from the Soviet Union. These missiles would go up into outer space and come back down and rain nuclear bombs onto the United States from outer space. Okay, so intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, they can be fired from one continent to another, and these missiles can carry nuclear bombs. All right, that makes sense. So the Strategic Defense Initiative was a program to develop artificial satellites that would hover above the United States of America. They would be equipped with laser beams, and these laser beams would focus in on those incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles, and they would zap them, and they would blow them up so that they would never reach the United States of America. So these missiles would be blown up in space. Okay, so I hope that made sense, and I hope that helps you to understand the title of this program, the Strategic Defense Initiative. So the goal here is to play defense, to protect the United States of America. These satellites are going to sort of form an umbrella over the United States of America, way, way, way up in outer space, so that any missile coming in to attack the United States of America will be zapped and blown up in outer space, far from doing harm from any human being. All right, when Ronald Reagan announced this on television, It was accompanied with some high quality early 1980s graphics, and this is what Americans saw: satellites in outer space blowing up intercontinental ballistic missiles that you might be able to tell here are hovering over the Soviet Union. All right, so hopefully the program makes sense. I want you to take a moment and think about the practicality of this. And is this actually possible? This is not the year 2020. This is the year 1983. Would it be possible to actually have satellites in outer space equipped with aggressive laser beams that could accurately, first of all, identify incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles, identify them as such, and then accurately zap them when these things are flying hundreds of miles an hour through the air? Is that practical? So obviously scientists are going to be involved in this. And they said, well, to develop this type of technology, it's going to cost billions of dollars, and it's going to take years of research. SDI, they tell Reagan, will only become functional, they think, at the very earliest by the year 2000, which is 17 years off at this point in time. This idea of SDI is going to be this extraordinarily expensive dream. But Reagan himself is passionate about it. We have to do this because once we have SDI, and he even believes, at least a couple of years later when he talks about it, once every country has SDI, then we eliminate the threat of any type of intercontinental nuclear attack. And we'll stop the possibility of nuclear war. Okay, so that's SDI. Now, a couple of things about SDI. First of all, for a lot of Americans, we're like, wait a minute, we're putting satellites in outer space equipped with laser beams, or at least that's the goal. Most of us Americans at the time, we did not call this SDI. We called it Star Wars. Yeah, Star Wars, after the film of the 1970s and the film series that was really big by the early 1980s. 1983 was also the same year the Return of the Jedi, that third film, came out. And so Star Wars was all the rage. And we found out that the President of the United States wanted to put satellites in outer space equipped with laser beams. Americans simply referred to it not as SDI, but rather as Star Wars. And so newspapers and magazines actually had to differentiate sometimes between when they were talking about Star Wars, if they're talking about Ronald Reagan's plan versus if they're talking about the film series. Okay, so there's that. But then this is an interesting thing for Reagan to present because Reagan has initiated this nuclear buildup in the United States of America, and now he wants to spend even more money to put these satellites in outer space that'll destroy incoming nuclear missiles and possibly eradicate the possibility of a nuclear war. So these two things with Reagan, build up our nuclear arsenal, but put these things in outer space that will stop a nuclear war from happening. It's kind of interesting he does both of these things at the same time. The other thing is, this is Ronald Reagan, this guy who wanted to cut government spending significantly, but he's increasing it astronomically when it comes to defense spending. So Ronald Reagan is an interesting, contradictory man. But hopefully I've presented things in such a way that you can understand why he's making the decisions that he's made. Okay. Let's talk about this conflict that's going on in the world at the same time. If you remember, during the Jimmy Carter administration, the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan because they were trying to protect a communist government that had taken over briefly in the capital of Kabul. And they thought Afghanistan is a undeveloped country. They don't have the resources or capacity to withstand a Soviet invasion. This should be low-hanging fruit. This should be a war that's really easy to win. Maybe a little bit like the Americans thought about Vietnam. But it wasn't. It wasn't. Very similar to our Vietnam War, the Afghan people had developed a hit-and-run style of guerrilla warfare. And this war became an international cause for religious reasons. So let me explain. The Soviet Union And their communist government is technically an atheistic government. In other words, there was no religion in the Soviet Union. Religion, for reasons that I'm not going to go into in this lecture, was considered to be bad. Part of the Soviet goal in creating a society where all people are equal wanted to get rid of all religions, which they saw as being non-scientific, backwards, and superstitious. So they didn't believe in freedom of worship. They didn't believe in religion. And for what it's worth, this is one major reason why Ronald Reagan, who is a devout Christian, identifies the Soviet Union as an evil empire. It's because you're not allowed to be Christian or Jewish or Muslim or anything in the Soviet Union. Okay, so when the Soviets invade Afghanistan, they want to bring this atheistic form of government to Afghanistan. And Afghanistan is filled with a majority Sunni Muslim population. Now, this majority Sunni Muslim population, like most religious populations, these people they have their religion, they believe in their religion, but their willingness to die for their religion, not that many people are probably willing to die. So if you get taken over by another country and you're forced to abandon your religion, it would be a very sad, frustrating, angry thing for you. It would be an anger-provoking thing for you, but it's better than being dead, right? But for a minority of passionate, very religious, Orthodox, conservative Muslims, for them, this is a holy war. And so this conservative Orthodox Muslim group created a militia. And the name of this militia, as you see here, was called the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen. And the Mujahideen were not exclusively Afghani. They made this an international cause. So they called upon all devout Sunni Muslims from across the world, come to Afghanistan and fight the Soviet Union. And if we die in a glorious cause to defend our faith. And when we die, we go immediately to heaven. So this was the Mujahideen. And sure enough, this became a rallying call for many conservative Sunni Muslims to go to Afghanistan, men, I think exclusively men, to go to Afghanistan to fight, to defend Afghanistan from the Soviet Union. And then, once the Soviet Union had been driven out of Afghanistan, then the Mujahideen, a conservative, very conservative, Orthodox religious group with some very specific ideas in terms of how men and women should live their lives, they would rule Afghanistan. All right, so the Mujahideen. Now, of all the people who came from around the world to join the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets, I would like to focus on this one individual. This is a man who was born and raised in a middle-class family in Saudi Arabia. His name was Osama bin Laden. As a young man, he left Saudi Arabia to go to Afghanistan to fight the Mujahideen. To fight with the Mujahideen as they are fighting the Soviets. So okay, now let's step back from this situation and think about it. The Soviet Union has invaded Afghanistan. The group that is the most successful in fighting the Soviets are a group of radical, Orthodox, conservative Muslims who are doing this hit-and-run guerrilla-style warfare against the Soviets, causing the Soviets a whole bunch of problems. The Soviets can't fully take Afghanistan because they can't eradicate the Mujahideen. And that's the situation in the early 1980s. Now, looking at this situation, on whose side, or rather, which side, does our government support? Which side is our government going to cheer for a victory? Well, it's the Mujahideen, of course. They're the ones who are stopping the spread of communism in the Soviet Union. Now, starting with the Carter administration, what is the United States of America doing in Afghanistan? Well, technically, nothing. Absolutely nothing. We were not getting involved in Afghanistan at all. Now, We were very interested in what was happening in Afghanistan, so news reporters and journalists were traveling to Afghanistan to report on what was happening. The most famous of which is this very famous American news reporter, Dan Rather. Dan Rather goes to Afghanistan, interviews the Mujahideen, these poor men with limited amount of arms and supplies who are doing hit-and-run guerrilla warfare tactics against the Soviets, who are struggling to fight for their freedom. And for them, it's a religious holy war so that they can practice their religion. But they have no help, they have no support, and they question whether or not, in the end, they can defeat the military might of the Soviet Union. Dan Rather's report plays on American national television. There were many journalists who reported on the situation in Afghanistan. Dan Rather was simply the most famous. And this had a profound effect on a handful of Americans who felt that the United States of America should do something in Afghanistan to help the Mujahideen, to stop the spread of the atheistic, communist Soviet empire. And coincidentally, one of those people who was inspired by Dan Rather and the other journalists who were coming out of Afghanistan was a member of our own federal government. And he was a Texan by the name of Charlie Wilson, who was in the House of Representatives. Charlie Wilson was an interesting guy. Today in history, people look at Charlie Wilson as one of the most important people who ended the Cold War. He is a very significant part of this story, but that is not the reputation that he had in the early 1980s. Charlie Wilson's nickname was Good Time Charlie. He had gotten into politics rather haphazardly. He had stuck with it. He was a very popular guy. His nickname was Good Time Charlie because among his favorite pastimes were getting drunk on whiskey, doing cocaine, and having parties with a lot of different women and having all sorts of, well, fun experiences with all these women at the same time. That was Charlie Wilson. Not the type of guy that you're going to say, wow, there's a stand-up American with good values. He's certainly not the type of guy who's going to change history. But in fact, he did. After reading and watching these news reports, Charlie Wilson was motivated to do something about it. So he's in the House of Representatives. He's in Congress in Washington, D.C. So he approaches the CIA. Remember, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Administration, these are our spies. These are the people who collect information for what's going on around the world. And he's able to ask them, what are we doing in Afghanistan? And the CIA reports, nothing. Charlie Wilson, well, why not? This is the Cold War. We've got the Cold War going on. We should be helping the Mujahideen. And so Charlie Wilson begins orchestrating a covert, top secret operation to help the Mujahideen. So here's a picture of Charlie Wilson in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen. What Charlie Wilson did was this. Good Time Charlie, who has connections with some of the wealthiest socialites in Texas, he approaches these individuals and he asks for money, donations of millions of dollars, telling these Texan millionaires, you are going to contribute to the fight for freedom around the world. This is a moral cause. We're going to stop the Soviets from taking over Afghanistan. And he gets the money. The money is then used by the CIA to purchase military weapons, and they deliver these military weapons to the Mujahideen. So here's Good Time Charlie in this picture, and I've already described to you his personal lifestyle choices. And he's with the Mujahideen, and the Mujahideen are perhaps the most socially conservative, or they represent the most socially conservative lifestyle in the entire world, where men should be able to be willing to fight and die for the cause of religion, that women have absolutely no rights, are to keep themselves completely covered up when they're in public, and they are totally enslaved to their husbands. This does not seem like a likely pairing, but a common enemy makes strange friends, and Charlie Wilson finds the means to support the Mujahideen. Now check out this picture. Here's Ronald Reagan meeting with a delegation of Afghan freedom fighters, the Mujahideen. Again, not a likely pairing, but everybody in this picture wants to see the stop of the spread of communism. Ronald Reagan went so far as to compare the Mujahideen with the founding fathers of the United States of America. And coincidentally, there's a portrait of George Washington behind Ronald Reagan, as you see here. This was an amazing collaboration. Now, specifically, here was the weapon that we delivered to the Mujahideen. This thing is called a Stinger. A Stinger, as you see here, is a handheld missile launcher that fires these heat-seeking missiles into the air. Afghanistan is a highly mountainous country. It is part of the highest, tallest mountain range in the world, the Himalayan mountains. And so the Soviet Union, in getting troops in and out of Afghanistan, they have to do so by helicopter. And so this is going to be what helps win the war for the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen can hide in their caves in Afghanistan with their Stingers. As soon as they hear the helicopters, they can pop out of the ground. They can fire this thing. This heat-seeking missile that gets shot up into the air hones in on the helicopter, so you don't have to be absolutely perfectly accurate. There's not much that the helicopter can do to get away, and it explodes, killing everybody inside. That's what we did. And guess what? It worked. In the year 1988, after 10 years of fighting, the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan. The Mujahideen wins. And some people say that this is a major cause for the collapse of the Soviet Union. They spent so much money trying to take over Afghanistan, just like the United States of America spent billions of dollars in Vietnam. All right, so this was a top secret operation back then. Today, a lot of people refer to this informally as Charlie Wilson's War. It was known in the CIA as Operation Cyclone. And it was great. It was this amazing story of this covert operation in which we supported the Mujahideen. We stopped the spread of the Soviet Union, and we won. So great, right? But the story has sort of a bad ending. The Mujahideen, after they won with the help of the United States of America, now wants to take over Afghanistan and rule Afghanistan. And they think, because the United States of America supported them in the fight against the Soviet Union, that the United States will help them establish a rule over Afghanistan. But now the United States of America, after the Mujahideen has won against the Soviet Union, we're like, whoa, wait a minute here. This is a group of conservative Orthodox Muslims that believe, one, in a universal Islamic state, a Muslim country where there is no freedom of religion. You have to be Muslim. Women have absolutely zero rights. They've got some very strange beliefs, some very, old-fashioned beliefs about religion, in that there should be really nothing taught in school, no math, no science, no literature, other than the Quran and the Hadith and a religious upbringing, and that's it. The United States of America, after this is over, and again, this was a top secret operation. Nobody's really acknowledging that the United States of America supported the Mujahideen. And the United States of America is like, whoa, we don't want anything to do with this group anymore. So what happens to the Mujahideen? Well, when the 1990s come around, the Mujahideen is now gone, but the people who are there, who are part of the Mujahideen, they've got new names. They form a political organization called the Taliban. And the goal of the Taliban is to take over all of Afghanistan and to create a theocratic country where conservative Orthodox Muslims make the rules, and they rule over the entire population. Not everybody in the 1990s in Afghanistan was supportive of the Taliban, and essentially Afghanistan throughout the 1990s was very politically and geographically divided, and there were little civil wars that were happening. So the Taliban defended itself by creating a military wing, a militia called Al-Qaeda. And in the 1990s, after the Cold War is over and there's no more Soviet Union, in the United States as the world's single superpower, Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, who had once upon a time received guns and support from the United States of America, turns upon the United States of America and begins committing acts of terrorism against the United States of America, both in New York City and in American embassies in North Africa in the 1990s. Of course, the most famous terrorist attack that he orchestrates is the terrorist attack of 9/11/2001. Now, there were many reasons why the Taliban and Al-Qaeda went from, receiving support from the United States of America back when they were the Mujahideen in the 80s to turning against the United States of America, and I do not have the time in this lecture to get into that. But in the course of American history, it's sad because, Operation Cyclone, Charlie Wilson's war, it was a victory. But then this victory, because of what happened to Afghanistan after we left, it essentially led to the age of global terrorism under Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So here's Charlie Wilson reflecting upon the whole situation, what he had to say about it. And he said, things happened, they were glorious, and they changed the world. And then we screwed up the end game. And that is what happened in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Back up to the Soviet Union. Boy, the Soviets are having problems. And these problems are almost entirely economic problems. Let's talk about the economic structure of the Soviet Union in contrast to the economic structure of the United States of America. Let's start with the United States of America first. Here in the USA, we have, as our foundation, a capitalist economy. So, what does this mean? It means that, in theory, we have the laws of supply and demand which guide our economy. Let's apply this. It means that all of us, here in the United States of America, we have things that we need and we have things that we want. These are demands. Like, for example, shoes. I think it can be said we all need shoes. So where do we get our shoes from? Do we go to the United States government to get our shoes? No. The government does nothing to provide shoes for the American people. Where do we get our shoes from then? Well, other Americans know that we need shoes, and so they decide that they can make money by making shoes and selling their shoes. So this is demand. Hey, I need some shoes. And this is supply. Hey, I want to make some money, so I'm going to become a shoemaker and or have a shoe store, and I'll sell the shoes. And some of us pay money to get the shoes, and we're happy because now we have shoes. And other people are happy because they sold shoes and they get to take the money of the people that they sell the shoes to, and it's a win-win. And the government, for the most part, does nothing other than the fact that they regulate the shoes and they make sure that the shoes are, I don't know, whatever, made of the actual material that they said they are made out of, that they're non-toxic material, or that the shoe sizes are accurate or whatever. For the most part, the government's not involved. And this is how capitalism works. And this is, when you get older, how you're going to make your money. You're going to try to identify a skill that you have, something you could do or something you can make that you can provide to the American people, and you'll get paid for this service or this good that you sell. All right, so that's a capitalist economy. The Soviet Union doesn't have a capitalist economy. The Soviet Union and all communists, they believe that, capitalism creates a bad situation in society, because inevitably you're going to have a handful of wealthy people and a whole bunch of poor people, and that's not fair. That's not right. You're going to have guys like John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, and then the masses that work in horrible conditions for next to nothing who work for these super rich people. And we got to get rid of that. We got to create a better, more humane, more fair society. So here's how things work in a communist country. They have something called a command economy. A command economy. And so think of it like this. The government is commanding its industrial sector with things to produce, with things to make. Okay, so it works like this. In the Soviet Union, do people there need shoes? Yeah, of course, everybody needs shoes. Okay, so here's what the Soviet government does. It takes a lot of people and a lot of time and a lot of effort. They identify how many people there are in the Soviet Union. they do their best to identify the shoe sizes necessary to fit the foot of everybody in the Soviet Union. And then they say, okay, we need this many million shoes and this many sizes and all of this. And so they direct or they command a shoe factory somewhere in the Soviet Union to produce the certain number of shoes by a certain time. And then these shoes get loaded up into trucks and they're sent all over the Soviet Union, which is the biggest country in the world. And they go to stores, government stores, where the people line up, like you see here, to go and buy their shoes for the next year. And that's literally how things worked. So imagine being a person who grew up in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. How things would usually work would be like this. There would be a government store. There would be a truck that would show up to this government store, and it would unload its goods. And you'd be like, "Oh, what is it? What is it? What's being unloaded?" And they'd be like, "Oh, it's shoes." And so you'd be like, "Okay." And so you go and you stand in line, and you would buy shoes, most likely for yourself and your family. And you would try to get, wherever you were in line, the best shoes that you could. Your options would be significantly limited compared to a shoe store in the United States of America today. And you do your best to get, the shoes that work for you. What do you need? You need work shoes or dress shoes or what? And then you try to get the right size to the best of your ability for yourself and most likely everybody in your family. I mean, all the shoes would be the same price because you did actually have to pay for the shoes. And of course, everybody in the Soviet Union technically receiving the same amount of pay. Your goal was just to simply be as close to the front of the line as you possibly could. But these lines sometimes you'd wait 2 or 3 hours for, some shoes. Some days would be pants day, some days would be shirt day, some days would be toilet paper day. I mean, you're not talking about luxury items. You're talking about basic goods that you had to live, that you needed to survive. And this became a standard of Soviet life. The command economy wasn't working because the Soviet Union wasn't producing enough shoes and shirts and pants or the toilet paper for their people. And why not? Well, because their government had to make a choice. What are we going to do? Are we going to pay for the war in Afghanistan or are we going to pay for more shoes? And they invariably chose war. They didn't want to lose a war. And then when you've got Ronald Reagan over in the United States of America building B-1Bs and increasing the nuclear supply of the United States, the Soviet government's like, we got to build new weapons, new fighter planes and new war material, whatever. We've got to make this stuff instead of making more shoes. The impact on the average person in the Soviet Union was devastating. Standing in line for hours on end was a commonplace thing. The rates of alcoholism because of this increased significantly because life was so miserable. Also, it was not uncommon in these lines that you see here for fights to break out because invariably some big thug would come and try to ditch everybody to get, the better shoes or whatever, and the people would fight him. Like, this was not an uncommon thing. So I want to say something personal about this. In the 1980s, when I was a boy, I grew up in Upper Arlington. As an adult, I had a friend who was the exact same age as me who grew up in the Soviet Union. And she talked about this. And I bring up shoes because she specifically spoke about shoes. She said, when I was in the 7th grade, my feet were growing, because, you're a 7th grader, so you're growing a lot. She's like, my mom went and she stood in line 3 hours to get me a pair of boots because she lived in the northern part of the Soviet Union. It was very cold. There's a lot of snow on the ground. And she's like, these boots were too tight, but I had to wear them for an entire year and my feet literally bled every day. And it was a year before I was able to get a new pair of boots and my feet were still growing. Now, that's just one article of clothing. That's just one thing. And you need a lot of things really to, live a comfortable lifestyle. And she would tell me these stories and I was like, well, I grew up in the United States and I had a pair of boots and I had a pair of sneakers and I had a pair of soccer cleats and I had a pair of baseball cleats and I had basketball shoes and I had all these shoes. I had a pair of dress shoes that I wore to church and, to other formal affairs and, and she was disgusted. But she knew this was also the case as well. But this was the contrast between growing up in the Soviet Union versus growing up in the United States in the 1980s. All right, so what you have here then is potentially a revolution, because the people who would stand in lines would say, they would chant, they had this chant, we can't go on like this, we can't go on like this, we can't go on like this. And this statement is a threat. What's the government going to do? The government's making choices with this command economy, and they're not taking care of their people. Their people are on the verge of revolution. All right. And then 1985 comes around. Now, throughout the first half of the 1980s, the government, the leaders of the Soviet Union were all old men. They were all tough guys. They didn't really respond to the needs of the people. But this changed in 1985 with the advent of a new premier of the Soviet Union. And his name was Mikhail Gorbachev. And when Mikhail Gorbachev took over the Soviet Union, it was clear that this man, who was a devout communist and a true believer in the communist system, was also a very different type of leader. Mikhail Gorbachev believed strongly in the equality of all people, which is fundamental to the theory of communism. But he also believed that the Soviet Union had grown into too much of a dictatorship. And Gorbachev believed in the freedom of all people. And so here's a man who is going to begin the process of trying to improve the lives of the people in the Soviet Union. Now, Mikhail Gorbachev, who is one of the most fascinating people in all of world history, before you know anything about his beliefs, his political ideologies, what he does as the leader of the Soviet Union, I want to show you a picture of Mikhail Gorbachev. And here is this picture. Here's Mikhail Gorbachev with his wife, Raisa Gorbacheva. Here's a picture of the two of them. Now, looking at this picture, what do you think makes Mikhail Gorbachev very different from every other leader of the Soviet Union? Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, all of those guys that we talked about before. What makes Mikhail Gorbachev different from this picture right here? This picture says a lot about Mikhail Gorbachev. There's two things that you should notice. One is he's smiling. It's as simple as that. He's smiling. Mikhail Gorbachev had a sense of humor. Mikhail Gorbachev liked to tell jokes. Now, let me pause right there. Not only is that very different from every other Soviet leader who was very tense and rigid and had this tough persona, Mikhail Gorbachev is a man who likes to laugh and tell jokes. Not only that, that makes him a great candidate for being friends with another man who likes to laugh and tell jokes, the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. Okay, so that's the first thing I want you to see in this image. The second thing I want you to see in this image is that he's standing with his wife. Now, I know you're not an expert on the history of Soviet leaders, but I guarantee you've never seen a picture of any of those guys standing next to their wives. The women, the wives of the Soviet leaders, were completely removed from them, from the men when they were engaged in anything political. Women were definitely kept in the background. At least the wives of the Soviet leaders were kept very, very much in the background. Mikhail Gorbachev relies upon his wife in developing policies. And in fact, the two policies that I'm going to tell you about here, he developed them with the help of his wife, Raisa. So when it comes to the ending of the Cold War, there's some feminism in here. Mikhail Gorbachev had a healthy, wonderful marriage and partnership with his wife, Raisa Gorbacheva. And when it came to making reforms, to improving the situation for the lives of the Soviet people, Raisa and Mikhail Gorbachev, they both worked together to come up with these two very important plans. All right, guys, I've got to teach you some Russian here. You need to know these Russian words. These are very important Russian words. These two things are glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost and perestroika. These are the two things that Mikhail Gorbachev institutes in the Soviet Union for the second half of the 1980s to improve the lives of all those Soviet people that were standing in line chanting, "We can't go on like this. We need a better life here in the Soviet Union." Now, Mikhail Gorbachev could have done nothing. He could have done absolutely nothing and said, "No, this is the way we're going to live." And if the people tried to revolt, you know what he could do? He could gun them down. It's a dictatorship. He has control of the military. If you want to stop people from having a revolt, if they're trying to revolt, easy, kill them. He had that power, and he could have done that. And honestly, had it been somebody else in power in the late 1980s, they might have chose to have used force against any type of revolutionary movement that was happening there. There will, in fact, be, at the end of the 1980s, 2 communist countries whose people are suffering a very similar situation. And when those people rose up, their government chose to use force. Those 2 countries were Romania and China. And I mean, they slaughtered people. But not Gorby. Gorby said, "No, we're going to have some policy changes here in the Soviet Union." All right, so the first one, glasnost. Glasnost, we must learn some Russian here. Glasnost is the Russian word for opening. So we're going to open up the Soviet Union. By opening up, we mean freedom of expression and freedom of travel. So, newspapers. You are not going to be subject to state-controlled censorship. You can print whatever it is you want to print. Writers can write whatever they want to write. Musicians can write whatever songs they want to, whatever they want to sing. You can now even criticize the government. You could have, satires like Saturday Night Live, stuff like that happening in the Soviet Union now. There's also freedom of travel. The Soviet Union is not going to stop you from traveling. And then also with the opening, with glasnost, are going to be the opportunities for foreign countries or foreign businesses to come into the Soviet Union to do business. And this should help to improve the Soviet economic system. Hey, so by the way, by the year 1990, one American business that opens up its first restaurant in Moscow is McDonald's. So because of the glasnost policy, there's now McDonald's in the capital of the Soviet Union. And this was amazing in and of itself. The Soviet people were astounded by this. I mean, this was an amazing historical development. It was an amazing change of culture. The oppression that the Soviet people had grown up with is now gone, totally gone. You could say whatever it is you wanted to say. You could go wherever it was you wanted to go, assuming you could afford to go there. It was an amazing breath of fresh air, the likes of which you and I have never experienced in our lifetime. But that was glasnost. All right, that's the first program. The other one is perestroika, bit of a longer word. Perestroika, the Russian word for restructuring. Okay, so I talked about the command economy that the Soviet Union had. All right, so now there will still be a command economy, but you will also have the opportunity to create your own business. So let's say you're tired of waiting in line for shoes and you're like, you know what? I think I can make my own shoes and sell my own shoes. So I can begin the process of doing this and doing this legally. So let's say I've got some material around my house. I feel like I can make shoes, whatever that would be. And, I can make some shoes and I can sell them to my neighbors. Now, prior to perestroika, this would be illegal. You're not allowed to do this. This is capitalism. But when perestroika goes into effect, you can now legally do this. And so new businesses can develop. So it's a command economy and it's got capitalism in it too. So it's what we would call today a mixed economy. And that's what Mikhail Gorbachev wanted to do. Now, sadly, this didn't work out that great to begin with because the first businessmen were actually gangsters because there were thugs that were going around. So I mentioned those government trucks that were leaving the factories and like delivering shoes to government stores in every town. Well, gangsters got some guns and they would just go and hijack those trucks and they would sell those shoes or whatever independently and take all this money. So there was gangsters on a black market that had been created in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. And essentially what perestroika did was it legitimized gangsters. It legitimized that black market. And so there were a lot of Soviets that didn't like the fact that with perestroika, gangsters were now the wealthiest people in their country. They were the new business class. And they're like, oh, this is the worst of capitalism. All right. Another aspect of perestroika involved Eastern Europe, and this is very important for the end of the Cold War. Previously, countries in Eastern Europe were controlled by the Soviet Union. So, like, for example, in countries like Poland in the year 1956, and Hungary in the year 1956, and Czechoslovakia in the year 1968, there had been various uprisings where they had tried to break free and do their own thing in terms of having their own government that was independent from the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union wouldn't control them. The Soviet Union always responded in 56 and later on in 68 by sending in their tanks and killing the people who were leading this revolution. So in other words, the Soviet Union, sometimes using a very heavy hand, was controlling these countries in Eastern Europe. Now, so when Gorbachev comes along, he says, no more of this, no more of this. All those countries in Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Romania, you do whatever it is you want to do. You do whatever it is you want to do. We, the Soviet Union, we are not going to control you. So if you want to break off of the Warsaw Pact, if you want to form your own, if you want to become a democracy, do whatever you so please. You do whatever you so please. We're not going to control you anymore. All right. I hope those two policies, Glasnost and Perestroika, I hope that makes sense. Please understand, Glasnost and Perestroika are very important reforms which lead to the end of the Cold War and ultimately the collapse of the Soviet Union. But we're not there yet. When Gorbachev issues these reforms, the United States of America, just like the people of the Soviet Union, are equally taken aback. This guy is amazing. He's providing opportunities for capitalism. He's lifting all censorship in the Soviet Union. He's telling the Eastern Bloc countries in Eastern Europe, hey, you can go free, you can do whatever it is you want. This is amazing. Check out the Time magazine there to the left. Gorbachev's revolution. Can he make it work? Is the Cold War fading? Wow, what an amazing individual. And in the White House, Ronald Reagan was giving direct reports, in particular by his vice president, George Bush Sr., not to be confused with George Bush, who was president from 2001 to 2009. George Bush Sr. had met Mikhail Gorbachev at a state diplomatic visit in Moscow before he was the leader of the Soviet Union. And George Bush told President Reagan, this guy's different. He is very different. You can talk to him. He's happy. He tells jokes. He likes to laugh. Oh, and hey, one more thing about Mikhail Gorbachev. Most of the leaders of the Soviet Union came from very powerful communist families. So they tended to be the sons of men who had had power previously. So if you were a leader of the Soviet Union, let's say in the 1930s during Stalin's years or during World War II or something like that, then your son would get a premier education at Moscow University or wherever. They would study political science, and then they would be almost guaranteed a job, so assuming that you were, a respected person of the Soviet government. They would be guaranteed a job and a high-ranking job in the Soviet government. So sort of these family dynasties have been created in the Soviet Union. Doesn't sound much like equality, does it? But politics was politics all over the world, and powerful men want their sons to have opportunities to become powerful too, no matter what political system you're living in. And so Mikhail Gorbachev is an incredible example of somebody who did not come from a family that had a lot of power. He came from a rural family, the son of farmers, and he got an education in agriculture and actually developed some methods of agricultural reform that worked. And so because he was a successful agricultural reformer and a good party communist, he was promoted within the government. And so when 1985 rolls around, and the government is looking for the next leader of the Soviet Union to handle this economic crisis, they're like, well, here's a guy who has a good track record of reform. We'll appoint him. So the Politburo selected Gorbachev to be the next leader of the Soviet Union. All right, so there's a lot on Gorbachev. Hey, and the term you see there on top there, our slang term for Gorbachev was Gorby. That's what a lot of people in the United States of America called him, Gorby. So back to Reagan. Reagan hears about this new type of leader in the Soviet Union. He's like, I got to meet him. I got to meet him. So the two met after Gorbachev had been ruling the Soviet Union not but a few months. In the fall of 1985, Reagan and Gorbachev met in Geneva, Switzerland. And this meeting was this monumental meeting because when they first met each other, they were allowed to just talk with each other in a room before they did any official diplomatic stuff. And when they met and they talked in this room, they had a limited amount of time to sort of get to know each other. But they went over the time allowed, which was only something like 15 minutes. But they kept talking and they kept talking, they kept talking. And with the exception of a translator, they're in the room alone talking. And the aides of both Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev wanted to open the door to go and say, okay, we're behind schedule. We have to get onto the diplomacy now. Talk about how the USA and the USSR are going to continue to interact with each other. And one of the American aides stopped anybody from entering the room and said, don't you understand what's going on here? The leader of the United States and the leader of the Soviet Union are becoming friends. Whoever opens this door deserves to get fired on the spot. This was an amazing thing. Guys, this was friendship. These were two men who loved to joke, who loved to tell stories, who loved to laugh, both of them. And one could argue that even though these two men are on the complete opposite end of the political spectrum, one is a conservative, Republican, capitalist, Ronald Reagan, and the other is a very liberal, egalitarian communist, Gorbachev, on the other end of the political spectrum, because both of these guys had a common humanity, because they both like to tell jokes and tell stories, that helped to bring an end to the Cold War. It was an amazing time in history. So what do I have to say about the Geneva Summit of 1985? That's it. The two men met, the two men talked, the two men became friends. All right, so this friendship inspires Ronald Reagan in particular. Now let's go back and remember Ronald Reagan. Inspired by this friendship and also inspired by a sense that he feels like he's been saved in 1981 by an assassin's bullet by God who has preserved him. He feels this calling from God to do something incredible to bring peace on earth. And inspired by that film, The Day After, that this is what the actual horrors of a nuclear war are going to be. He had developed SDI as a way of preventing a nuclear attack. But now, with a new person in charge of the Soviet Union, a guy who seems to have some humanity to him, a man who can joke and he can tell stories with, Ronald Reagan is now going to do his next big move. He comes up with an idea. This idea is both extraordinarily radical and extraordinarily simple. Ronald Reagan wants to create peace on earth and get rid of the possibility of nuclear war. So, he has another meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev almost exactly a year later in the capital of Iceland, Reykjavik. So they meet in Iceland, where Ronald Reagan proposes his most radical idea, and it's also his most simple idea. This idea is called zero options. Zero stands for the number of nuclear weapons that the United States and the Soviet Union should have. Ronald Reagan's very radical and very simple idea is this. Hey, Gorby, let's just destroy all of our nuclear weapons. Let's just get rid of all of the nuclear weapons in the world. Let's just get rid of all of them. You destroy yours, we'll destroy ours. And there'll be no more nuclear weapons. We'll make sure that other countries, because we're the two most powerful countries, other countries destroy their nuclear weapons. There's only a handful of countries in the world that have a nuclear weapon. Britain, France, Israel, India. We'll make sure that they don't have nuclear weapons either. We can put the pressure on them. Let's go for this. Zero option. Gorby, what do you say? Let's get rid of all nuclear weapons. All right. I think that makes sense. Think of that. President of the United States saying to the Soviet leader, let's just get rid of all of our nuclear weapons. How did this pan out? Here's what happened at the Reykjavik summit. Reagan says to Gorby, let's get rid of all of our nuclear weapons. Zero option. Gorby says to Ronald Reagan, I like that idea. I'm willing to go through with it. Let's do zero option. Ronald Reagan, well, that's great, Gorbachev. Gorbachev said, but if we go through with zero option, that means you can also stop your strategic defense initiative. Get rid of SDI. So we'll get rid of all of our nuclear weapons, but you, the United States of America, must stop SDI. Ronald Reagan, but I can't stop SDI. SDI is not an offensive program, it's a defensive program. It's in the name, Strategic Defense Initiative. And I have promised the American people that I will defend them. I cannot let go of SDI. Gorbachev, okay, well, if you refuse to get rid of SDI, then we don't go through with zero option. Ronald Reagan, okay, how about this? How about if we continue SDI, but we also give you SDI as well, so that we both have SDI and we can both protect both of our countries? Gorbachev's response to this, wait a minute. Weapons placed in outer space given to us by the United States of America, I cannot trust this. First of all, I can't trust that you're actually going to give us anything. And then if you do give us something, you're giving us weapons to place in outer space above our country that were made in your country. These still could be used against us. President Reagan, please just get rid of having weapons in outer space. Reagan says, I can't do that. And while the two men were talking, Reagan wrote on a piece of paper to an aide, am I right? ? Slid it over to them. And the aide looked down at the piece of paper and wrote back, yes, and slid it back to Reagan. And Reagan held his ground. He's not going to get rid of zero option. He's not going to get rid of SDI. And so because of this exchange, zero option never went through. Okay. Now, for what it's worth, SDI is only at this point in time in 1986 still in the preliminary stages. It's still only it hasn't made it even out of the lab yet. They're still trying to develop the technology to begin the process of building anything to put in outer space for defensive purposes. And so, in other words, SDI is really nothing at this point in time in history. But this summit is considered to be a failure. When both Reagan and Gorbachev left this meeting, the press reported on how angry both of them looked. These were not the friendly, Reagan and Gorby that we'd seen in Geneva. These guys were mad and angry with each other. And it was considered to be a failure, and I think still is considered to be a failure. This was a monumental moment in history where we could have gotten rid of all nuclear weapons around Earth. We could have done it. In the United States of America and the Soviet Union would have been a forefront in bringing an end to the possibility of a nuclear war. It was an amazing moment. Now, why didn't it go through? Well, you can blame either Reagan or Gorby or both of them. You could have blamed Gorby for, saying, hey, get rid of SDI when SDI was absolutely nothing at this point in time in history. And so, why bring that up? Why even deal with it? Or you could blame Reagan. Okay, because SDI is nothing at this point in time in history. He could agree, like, okay, we'll stop SDI. It was this hang up over Star Wars. It was this hang up over SDI. But it was one of the most frustrating negotiations in the history of American-Soviet negotiations, and very sad, and it brought a lot of frustration to both Reagan and Gorbachev. But as a whole, even with the failure of zero option in the Reykjavik summit in Iceland in 1986, the Cold War is still relaxing because, you've got Glasnost and Perestroika, which are getting ready to go into effect in the late 1980s. There's more freedom in the Soviet Union and throughout Eastern Europe. And Ronald Reagan decided to do something to put pressure on Mikhail Gorbachev. The Berlin Wall had been a symbol of the division between the Soviet world and the American world, between communism and democracy, between dictatorship and freedom. And Ronald Reagan thought, if Gorbachev believes so much in this freedom that he advocates for in glasnost and perestroika, why doesn't he really free the people of Europe? Why doesn't he just take down the Berlin Wall? So, in probably his most grand moment, Ronald Reagan flies to West Berlin, stands in front of the Berlin Wall, and demands for Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down that symbol, which was the ultimate symbol of the Cold War, and to free people to move between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, between East Berlin and West Berlin. It's probably Ronald Reagan's most famous speech of many eloquent speeches that he gave. Let's listen to it.
Behind me stands a wall that encircles the free sectors of this city, part of a vast system of barriers that divides the entire continent of Europe. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Now, Mr. Gorbachev did not go and open up that gate, and he did not tear down that wall. However, even though zero option did not go through, the following year, in 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev came to the United States of America, where he met with Ronald Reagan on his home turf. And the two signed major, sweeping treaties to significantly reduce the number of nuclear weapons held in both the United States of America and the USSR. Both of these men had a strong emotional sense, not just an intellectual knowledge, but an emotional sense of how devastating a nuclear war would be. They were scared of it. They were horrified at how this would end civilization. Both of these men were committed to ending the possibility of a nuclear war. Now, they could have gone through entirely with zero option in '86, but that didn't happen. And hopefully I did my best to describe how it did not happen. SDI had been the sticking point in that conference, in that summit meeting in Reykjavik. But both of these men were still dedicated to at least reducing the possibility of a major nuclear war. And so in December of '87, Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan signed several nuclear arms limitation treaties, and the world became a slightly safer place. 1989 is considered to be one of the most pivotal years in all of world history. When asked when did the Cold War end, many historians will at least mention 1989 as being either the last year of the Cold War or the year that led to the end of the Cold War. For a lot of us here in the United States of America, 1989, especially the fall of 1989, November of '89, going into the early months of 1990, it was an extraordinarily exciting time. A lot was happening. There was a genuine sense that the world is changing, and changing for the better. More people are becoming more free. All right, so what happened? Well, the best way to think of 1989 is that the policies in the Soviet Union of glasnost and perestroika were coming to fruition. People are speaking out more freely. There are, in Eastern Europe in particular, new political parties that are forming, most famously the Solidarity Party in Poland, which wanted to take over the Communist Party that was in Poland, that had been ruling Poland since the end of the Second World War. Major protests were happening in Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and Romania. And in Eastern Europe, the communist leaders looked to the Soviet Union and said, are people rising up? They're doing all these things. They want to change the government. They want us out of power. Help us, help us, help us. And Gorbachev was like, no, take care of your own, take care of your own country. And maybe you should listen to your own people. You know, it's okay. This is an era of change. This is an era of reform. The Soviet Union's reforming. You should reform too. And this desire among people living throughout the communist world to pressure their government to reform spread to another communist country in Eastern Asia, China. It spread to China too. In late May of 1989, thousands of students and other young people came to the capital city of Beijing, China. They went to the largest public gathering space in the entire world, a place called Tiananmen Square. Thousands of them gathered where they sang songs and chanted phrases asking for more freedom of expression. In other words, the same glasnost policies that have been implemented in the Soviet Union, that great communist country, young people in China were asking for those same freedoms in China. By the time early June of 1989 rolled around, the Chinese government decided to respond. They simply asked the students to go home, to respect their government's wishes and to go home. When the students did not go home, the Chinese government called in its military and massacred the students. Numbers vary in terms of how many of the students died. The number that I have in my mind hovers somewhere between 5,000 to 6,000. Recently, I heard as many as 10,000 were killed. That's not wounded, but killed. But feel free to look this event up. Just simply look up Tiananmen Square, 1989. And I actually encourage you to look up Tiananmen Square, 1989. Because you know what? You can look this up on an internet search in the United States of America. When you look up Tiananmen Square 1989 in China on their internet search engines, nothing comes up. When there was pressure for reform in China in 1989, the government responded by massacring its own people. And that ended the protests. And China today remains a communist government. China today remains a single-party dictatorship with significant control over the press and today over the internet. If you grow up today in China and you go to school, you are not taught about what happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989. The government does not want you to know about it. If you do learn about Tiananmen Square what happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989, and you're growing up in China today, it's probably because an elder, likely your parents, have told you about it, but they've also told you not to talk about it. Talking about this, talking about how the Chinese government slaughtered its own civilians, can potentially land you in jail in China. We don't live in China. We live in the United States of America. We're allowed to talk about our country's own atrocities. And certainly our country has done incredibly horrible things. The incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, the Indian Wars, what happened to the Lakota Sioux. We've learned about all these horrible things that our government has done in American history. But that's because we live in a free society. In China, you have a communist dictatorship, and the kids who grew up in China aren't allowed to know about what I just taught you. Thousands of people in China were slaughtered because they asked their government to give them some very basic fundamental human rights that really, if we're honest, that you and I take for granted. The rest of the world did know what the Chinese government did to its own people. And for the communist world, the Soviet Union included, governments realized that they had a choice to make. And that choice was either between engaging in democratic and economic reform or slaughtering your own people. The other country that chose slaughter was Romania. But the president of Romania, who was actually captured by his own people, and a handful of people who videotaped him being placed on trial, being told, you slaughtered your own people, and we know that you did this, and this is why we're going to execute you. And they filmed these people executing the president of Romania. That president's name was Nicolae Ceausescu. So in the case of Romania, it ended differently than China, because the people actually, even though they were getting slaughtered, some of them were able to capture the president and kill him, and then begin the process of democratizing, but not after a huge bloodshed. But that's what the countries in this part of the world have to deal with. And the leaders have to make a choice. What do? Do we democratize? Or do we slaughter our own people so that we, the communist government, can maintain power? Most famously, this situation came to a head on the night of November the 9th, 1989, in Berlin, the capital city of East Germany. The East German government was trying to decide, well, what do we do? Do we reform, or do we have a crackdown on our own people? The East German people were marching through the streets. There was a very famous mass protest that happened in the city of Leipzig in East Germany. And now those protests had spread into East Berlin, the capital. The president of East Germany actually just quit his job and moved to the Soviet Union, leaving a subordinate to try to deal with the situation. And what happened in East Germany was this. This is a little complicated, but I'll try to make it as clear and as simple as possible. The East German government made a decision that it was going to allow its people to engage in freedom of travel. In other words, East Germans can now travel to West Germany. East Berliners can now travel into West Berlin. In other words, the people can go to where they're free. The government made this decision, but they didn't specify when this freedom of travel was going to take place. And in this very bureaucratic way, the government has a press conference where a statement, a very long statement that's, I don't know, like 10 pages long or whatever, is given to an official government communications director, and he must read these 10 pages. Or however long it was. I don't know how many pages it was, but it was a substantial document. And so he reads this very, very boring, long and dry and drawn out thing. But he clearly says in it, the East German government is going to open up travel. And so that's it. This particular government official has done his job. He's read the report to the press, and the press is going to report it. But the press actually has questions. And their one big question is, when is this freedom of travel allowed to happen? This government, this low-ranking government guy, he has no clue. And he's like, it's not in the report. I mean, he didn't even practice reading the report. He doesn't even know what's in it. He just read it. And he says, I don't know. And then he says, well, immediately, I think. And so this low-level government official says, we have freedom of travel immediately. As soon as this press conference is over, the people of East Berlin go up to the Berlin Wall. There are tens of thousands of East Germans now pressing against the checkpoint gates of the Berlin Wall. Now, the Berlin Wall is guarded by the East German state security police, the Stasi as they called them, and they've got one order: shoot to kill anybody who tries to go to the other side. So they're calling their officials, their superior officers, like, there's tens of thousands of people, so they've got the right to travel to the other side. What do we do? And nobody's picking up the phone on the other end. And so now it's down to these border guards who have no clear orders of what to do, and tens of thousands of people who are pressing upon the gate. And then And I mean, just think, what would you do if you were a guard and your job is to shoot? You've got one order: shoot to kill anybody who goes to the other side. And yet you've got tens of thousands of your countrymen, other East Germans, who are like shaking the gates, demanding to be let through. That the government has just issued an order that they're allowed to travel, but you have received no order about this. What would you do? And then this incredible moment happens. This wonderful moment happens at one of the checkpoints. One of the guards just has a what the hell moment and lifts up the gate. They just lift up the gate. And tens of thousands of East Germans march into West Berlin. Other checkpoint guards hear about this. They open up the gates, and then next thing you know, East Berliners are walking into West Berlin. It's nighttime now. This goes into the middle of the night, and West Berliners have gathered there to greet them, to hug them, complete strangers, but to welcome them to the freedom of West Berlin. And it was this amazing moment in history. American news crews were there. In particular, CNN was there to capture like the first moments of the opening up of the Berlin Wall. It was a historic event. The West Berliners then decide, well, now with the East Berliners coming through, we're going to take down the wall. And so this happened. West Berliners went home and got anything from sledgehammers to little chisels and began the work of dismantling the Berlin Wall piece by piece. And here they are, taking out their anger at a wall that has separated them, some of them from their families and loved ones, for over 35 years. The ultimate symbol of the Cold War is coming down. When this major historical event happened in the world, I was a sophomore in high school in November of 1989, and I was taking German, and this is all we did in our German class was watch the news and watch the Berlin Wall coming down. And I remember my German teacher just tearing up. This was one of the most incredible and joyful moments in history, and a lot of people mark this as the end of the Cold War. Germany will unify in the year 1990. And essentially what happened was the East German government dissolved. The West German government took over East Germany. They moved the capital of West Germany, from the city of Bonn, which was in West Germany, back to the original capital in Berlin. And Germany is reunified. But what about the Soviet Union? What about the Soviet Union? Well, the spirit of reform had swept through the Soviet Union as well. Glasnost and Perestroika had enabled people to gather freely and to speak openly and critically about the government. Perestroika had provided economic reform, but economic reform takes time. And essentially what happened with that economic reform was you still had a command economy, but then you had the rise of gangsters. The economic opportunities had not trickled down, if I could use that phrase, to the average Soviet citizen. And in some cases, things just weren't getting better. Capitalist reform takes time. And a lot of people who were excited by Gorby now got really angry with Gorby. It was great in like 1987, where there was all this freedom of expression and international cooperation. But then after a couple years, when you get to 1989, 1990, 1991, there's a little bit of frustration when you still have those long lines that you have to stand in. And the only people that seemed to be making money were the people who were gangsters operating a black market before Glasnost and Perestroika, and now they're making the money and they're rising up in terms of their power and prestige. And this isn't really creating many job opportunities or better pay or even a more significant access to goods in the late 1980s. In other words, the economy is stagnant. And then add on to it this. The Soviet Union used to be a superpower. Now it's clear the Soviet Union is losing its prestige on the world stage, and the United States is emerging as the victor of the Cold War. Well, that's humiliating. And then you have American corporations like McDonald's showing up. And that's both good because, it's a new option for food and it's cheap food and a lot of people like it, even though it might not be that healthy, but whatever. But it's sort of a slap in your face that the United States won the Cold War. Here's McDonald's in Moscow. So, okay, how's Gorbachev's Soviet Union doing? Well, they've got more freedom of expression now. They've got economic opportunities, but there's still sort of economic stagnation, and the Soviet Union has been internationally humiliated because they're losing the Cold War. Oh yeah, and they also lost the Soviet-Afghan War in 1988. So what happens is this. There's a climactic event that happens in August of 1991. Mikhail Gorbachev was actually on vacation in the southern part of Russia in a large palace, in Russian called a dacha, on the Black Sea in the southern part of Russia. And while he was there, the phone lines to his home got cut, and soldiers show up to surround his home. The Soviet military was trying to take over the Soviet Union. It seemed like other hardliners in the Politburo had encouraged the military to do this so that they could take action, capture, potentially kill Mikhail Gorbachev, take control of the Soviet Union, and implement a China-like policy towards these reforms and uprisings. In other words, kill their own people, restore order, and maintain the communist dictatorship in your country. Worked for China, it can work for the USSR too. So this image that you're looking at here, he's on vacation in his home in the south of Russia on the Black Sea. He, at this point in time, realizing that the phone lines were cut, he had no communication with the outside world, and that his home was now being guarded. He had his wife film him. So they had an old VHS camcorder, and he had Raisa, his wife, film him as Mikhail Gorbachev issues what he thinks might be his last statement to the world. And so he thinks that after he's killed, that his wife can sneak this video cassette tape out of Russia or out of the Soviet Union, and the world can know here's exactly what happened, that Mikhail Gorbachev didn't freely hand over power, or he wasn't, he didn't accidentally die. He wanted his side of the story to be told. But all right, it's August of 1991. In go the tanks to into the Soviet capital of Moscow to put down all the protests and reforms that are happening there. And here's what's amazing. Things turned out differently in the Soviet Union than in China. When the Russian people saw the tanks coming and they ran up to the tanks to plead with them, to not fire upon them, to not try to disperse them, to not tell them to go home, but rather to join them, then one by one, the Red Army, the soldiers in the Red Army had to make a decision. Do we kill our own people or do we join them? And guess what happened? They joined them. When the hardliners of the government send soldiers to slaughter their own people, and the soldiers refuse to do it, when the soldiers universally refuse to do it, but instead decide to join the people, then those hardliners in government stand no chance. It's now their turn to run away. Now, Gorbachev is going to survive this whole ordeal. He is not going to get killed by the people that surrounded his palace, his home, his dacha in the south of Russia. But during this event, a new, more radical and democratic Russian politician steps forward. He was there when the tanks were stopped and the tanks were turned around. And he actually climbed up upon a tank to give a speech that was very critical of Mikhail Gorbachev, who said that Mikhail Gorbachev, through his half measures at reform, had only created a worse situation, and that there should no longer be a Soviet Union, but a new, free, democratic Russian Federation. And this politician's name was Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin was once on very friendly terms with Mikhail Gorbachev. But now, given this crisis that had happened, where Gorbachev's reforms hadn't really worked, at least they hadn't worked economically, Yeltsin saw the opportunity for personal advancement. He knows the Russian people are angry. During this event in August of 1991, Gorbachev was nowhere to be found. Yeltsin gives these dramatic speeches. Let's have freedom. Let's have democracy. Let's get rid of the Soviet Union. A few months later, in December of 91, Mikhail Gorbachev in Moscow was addressing the Politburo, the governing body of the Soviet Union. And while giving his speech, Boris Yeltsin did something absolutely unprecedented in Soviet history. He stood up to the leader of the Soviet Union. He literally walked up to him, interrupted his speech, and said, "I have here a list of grievances against you. The people do not like you. I would like for you to read these grievances out loud to the Politburo." Gorbachev said, "I will look at these later," absolutely astounded that anybody had dared to interrupt him while he's giving a speech to the Politburo. Boris Yeltsin, who was beginning to walk back to his seat, turns right back around, goes up to Gorby and says, "No, you read him now." It was at this moment that Gorbachev realized that he has no more power. So Gorbachev made the decision to resign. If you're able to look closely at this image of the New York Times article on Gorbachev's resignation, you may note that Gorbachev resigned on Christmas Day, December the 25th, 1991. How do we evaluate the premiership of Mikhail Gorbachev? He became the leader of a communist dictatorship with a failing economy. He tried to reform that dictatorship not by cruel force, which he easily could have done, but by opening up the gates to freedom. And by opening the gates to freedom, even just a little bit, it created the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union. It created the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. It did not create the collapse of communism in China because the Chinese government chose to slaughter their own people. But he unleashed this wave of change that brought freedom to people. Now, Gorbachev wanted to maintain a single-party communist state in the Soviet Union. He still believed in a command economy, partially a command economy, and in the benefits of a communist state. But he couldn't figure out, and I don't know if anybody could figure out, how do you keep that single-party communist dictatorship and allow for freedom? By allowing for the Soviet Union and really the entire communist world to reform itself, he paved the way for the collapse of communism. Some people today really admire Mikhail Gorbachev, who, as of April of 2020, is still alive, and somebody sees him as somebody and some people see him as an individual who completely mismanaged the situation and actually made the situation in the Soviet Union worse than it was in the early 1980s. Now, in 1991, Ronald Reagan was no longer the president of the United States of America. His 2 terms were up as of January of 1989. The president at the time, during the time of both the Tiananmen Square massacre, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the end of the Soviet Union, was this man, George Herbert Walker Bush, George Bush Sr. He was the former director of the CIA. He was a World War II hero who had been injured in action in World War II before that, long before that, and then got into politics, was in the CIA, and then became vice president of the United States of America during the Reagan administration, and then ran for president in his own right in 1988. Won that presidency fairly easily, I might say, against the Democratic contender whose name was George Dukakis. And he was the president who got to see these amazing sweeping changes, this incredible time in world history, where we saw the collapse of communism and the spread of democracies throughout the world. And for him, it was an amazing thing to give an address on Christmas Day to the people of the United States of America, informing them that the Cold War was now over and that the Soviet Union was now gone. The Cold War, which had defined American foreign policy for 45 years, and what had defined our American identity for that same period of time, that was now all over. It was an amazing time where we wondered, wow, I wonder what the 90s are going to be like. The United States is the world's single superpower. Our ideas of democracy are spreading throughout the world, even into the former Soviet Union. It was an extraordinarily exciting time, and George Bush got to deliver this message on Christmas Day of all days. Let's watch this Christmas Day message of President George Bush.
The superpowers had confronted each other relentlessly. Now, under intolerable pressure, one side withdrew.
Да, Джордж, дорогой, приветствую.
Gorbachev had done as much as anyone to end the Cold War. He called Bush and told him this was his last day in office.
There was a kind of sadness. The finality of it hit me pretty hard, and it was Christmas time and holiday time. And I felt that a friend was hurt, and I wasn't happy about that.
That night, the red flag of the Soviet Union was lowered for the last time. In Washington, Bush made his Christmas broadcast.
For over 40 years, the United States led the West in the struggle against communism and the threat it posed to our most precious values. This struggle shaped the lives of all Americans. It forced all nations to live under the specter of nuclear destruction. That confrontation is now over.
And there it is, United States history students. At the dawn of the 1990s, the Soviet Union is no more. The Cold War is over. Democracies were spreading. It was an amazing and exciting time. The United States of America was suffering from a recession at this time, but overall, it was an amazingly positive and optimistic moment in history. So there you go, guys. This was a very long lecture on the end of the Cold War and the story of Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. And hey, I hope you liked it, guys. I hope you learned a lot from it. I certainly love that story of Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. Hope you got into it a little bit too. And hey, I'm done. Have yourselves a great day. Bye-bye.